Hello everyone and welcome to today's AJS-37 Viggen for DCS World tutorial. In today's lesson, we will be covering cockpit familiarization and cold start procedures. Ahead of our familiarization, here is my current configuration of controls for the Thrustmaster Warthog. You will notice that I have elected to map very little of the controls, and that's because you really won't need it. These control mappings can likewise very easily be transferred to an X56 or other HOTAS. As I like to point out, when you first get into the pit, you are confronted with a whole bunch of switches, knobs, and Swedish. There is an English cockpit mod available, however I have found it's easier to use than native Swedish. Every manual, tutorial, and guide makes use of the Swedish indications. This means if you're using the English cockpit mod, you're going to spend time learning and remembering that ATK means attack in the English, but then ANF in Swedish, at which point you might as well have just learned to use ANF. There are a lot of controls in here, but you only use about a quarter of them in flight, and more than half of them you'll be able to use a kneeboard as a guide while you're parked. The Viggen is remarkably simple to operate, and the layout might seem foreign at first, but it's remarkably logical and intuitive. I will be introducing you to various systems in a pattern to help build foundational familiarization. This means that rather than simply drone on about what each switch does going linearly through the pit, I will address systems intuitively and with a goal of building recognition of systems in a manner you're likely to utilize them. After all, in front of you are individually 4 different groups of indicators you could fly the Viggen from. The Viggen is the opposite of Western birds, and that will give you the information in as many ways that it can, but there's only one way to do anything. The instrument panel is dominated by the radar display. This is because the AJS-37 was built to be flown from this system. When in certain operational modes, you will receive ADI overlays on this screen, and arrayed around it is your primary course and heading indications on a rotating compass ring. Also inlaid with this system is your general caution indicator and your threat direction indication lights. To the left, placed relative to need, is your T-cluster instruments. Primary altimeter, primary attitude director indicator, which also includes a slip indicator and vertical speed indicator. Further left is the airspeed indicator in both Mach and hundreds of kilometers per hour. At the top, located just under and to the left of the HUD glass, is the AOA indicator. To the right of the radar screen, you will find your fuel indicator, engine RPM indication, and engine pressure ratio. To the right and up is your navigational indications, which are displayed as an indicated waypoint and a distance to the waypoint. Waypoint distance is indicated in kilometers from a range of 40 kilometers, and then in Swedish miles. The indication at the bottom of the gauge will tell you which is displayed. A Swedish mile is 10 kilometers, so 5 Swedish miles is 50 kilometers. On the fuel gauge, there is a striped needle or tie. This indicates the lowest possible fuel state for the given waypoint. If the primary needle is lower than the tie, you do not have enough fuel to proceed on the entire course as indicated. We've now covered 2 of the 4 instrument groups you could fly the Viggen from. Let's go ahead and cover the other 2. The heads-up display in the Viggen is the primary flight instrument system. It will display all of the information required to entirely fly the aircraft through the entire mission. The HUD initially appears quite devoid of information from a Western perspective, and almost all information is graphically indicated rather than numerically indicated. While we will cover HUD indications in depth in the future, graphical indications are recycled in various modes to indicate separate data. Initially, this will be very confusing, but this is often intuitive and will be covered in every lesson. It will click one day and you'll be amazed at how much information it gives you while seemingly giving you nothing. HUD brightness and elevation are controlled here. In general, HUD elevation is a matter of preference, but in the down position, you will readily see data needed in takeoff, while in the up position, you will have better visibility of data needed in flight. On the right side of the HUD are these 2 switches, and these will introduce you to the first Swedish words to learn and know: fran, and till, or off and on respectively. You will find if English is your native language, a lot of these words are cognates, sounding similar and meaning the same thing. The Slav SI switch removes non-critical data from the HUD when flying under 100 meters, when in the till or on position. This reduces confusion and distraction in the high-speed, low-level attack the Viggen was built to execute. I prefer to leave this on because the change in symbology can be a useful indication of altitude if you're occupied focusing on other things. The adjacent switch, HOJD-CC, selects which altimeter is displayed on the HUD, the radar altimeter or the barometric. If you can't remember what that switch does, you'll see HOJD written on your altimeters, and the R in RHM is radar. Knowing that, LD is pretty self-explanatory as barometric. The Slav SI setting is always slaved to the radar altimeter. Though not part of the HUD, the Master Mode switch here configures the primary configuration of the Viggen's avionics system, which directly determines HUD symbology. The master modes are BER, standby, NAV, navigation and general flight, ANF, attack, most weapons deployment, SPA, reconnaissance, landing, which has NAV for instrument and PO for pilot observation or VFR approach. We will cover the different modes in depth in their relevant lessons. The fourth and final set is the backup set. Your conventional T instruments can be found just right of the radar indicator, with a magnetic compass heading, altimeter with separate adjustments for pressure, airspeed indicator, and backup HSI. Due to the way the avionics system works, you may find you utilize the backup indicators asynchronously with the primary set simultaneously, rather than as a true backup set. The next group we will look at is the autopilot system. This is where the infamous AFK, or Automatic Fart Control System, is located, as well as the SPOC and traditional autopilot modes are controlled. Located entirely in the top left, there are 3 green illuminated buttons. When switched on, they will illuminate. SPOC is referred to as the primary dampening, but is more easily understood as the principal fly-by-wire system, or FLICUS, in other Western birds. This is illuminated by default, and really only needs to be disconnected in very specific emergencies. ATT is your attitude hold. When pressed, it will lock the attitude as commanded. HOJD, which you no doubt recognize again and certainly guessed, is your altitude hold. If you are roughly level, the system will level off and fly straight and level. If you are in a bank, it will hold the horizontal attitude as well, keeping in mind that the HOJD button activates both itself and the ATT button. The altitude hold button will also automatically trim the aircraft for straight and level flight, even with asymmetrical wing loads. While we cover the AFK system in depth in the landing tutorial, we will cover the placement of indicators in Mode 3 button here, as well as the AFK lever here. Since they correspond to the topic at hand, adjacent to the AFK lever is the landing gear lever. You have emergency trim switches here for roll, pitch, and yaw. There is an additional and guarded yaw trim knob that adjusts the autopilot's yaw. Though you will undoubtedly never remember what Renflinging means, it has a plastic cover which should help you remember it's hard to access, meaning not for primary use. The final system to cover in detail is the weapons controls, which are all located on a singular panel. While the various configurations and meanings will be discussed in depth in other lessons, the 4 controls here are as follows: Weapons Selector knob, Sight Mode Interval knob, Release Mode switch, Target Mode Preparation switch. Also located here are your Stores Jettison buttons, X-Tank being the centerline fuel tank, and NODF, the Emergency Weapons Jettison. Keep in mind these are also guarded. The primary pilot avionics interface is via the CK-37 data panel, located here. This system can be the bane of student Viggen pilots because it's entirely numeric. Upsides are that it isn't in Swedish as a result, and it gives you fine control of weapons and other systems. 95% of the commands you input are going to be done parked on the ramp looking at your kneeboard. We will cover in depth various inputs in later lessons. In the next part of this lesson, we will be covering cold start procedure, which will identify many more of the systems present, while additional control groups will be left to be identified in later lessons, such as the radar controls, EP-13 collimated sight, and electronic warfare systems. However, there are a handful of indications and controls that are used in advanced operation of the Viggen, but are otherwise not covered in later lessons in this series. I will be covering these now so that you can return in the future as needed, but this remaining familiarization section is not required for basic aircraft operation. On the central instrument panel right side is the fall to last, or weapons release indicator. This illuminates when the final mission munition has been deployed. Keep in mind, the Viggen is intended to make a single attack run, releasing all of its carried munitions in a single pass. This is covered in detail in the weapons lessons later. Adjacent to this is the transonic flight warning light. In transonic flight, the Viggen suffers from reduced flight characteristics as well as air intake flow issues. The Spock system will automatically make system adjustments to maintain positive flight performance in transonic flight, but in general, Viggen pilots should avoid such conditions, and the light and alarm are to remind you of that. Also by these indicators is an accelerometer, self-explanatory, and a stopwatch clock system for precision strike and navigational purposes. By your knees on the right side are 3 gauges, providing engine nozzle position indication, which can also be determined by the zone indication lights under the engine RPM gauge. Next is the exhaust gas temperature gauge and the pilot's oxygen system pressure indicator. Off the left knee, the remaining gauge is the cabin pressure indicator. Under these gauges on either side of your knees are the warning and indicator light panels. These are of course color-coded, with red alerts indicating emergency situations, green indicating correct statuses, and orange constituting alerts. Also in this area, located under the warning placard on the left, is a series of buttons and switches. Notable now is the indicator light switch, halve meaning half, hell meaning full. Adjusts the aforementioned warning panel lights. Also located here is the emergency light switch. The other switches will be covered later. Now that we have covered the general layout of controls and indicators, let's dive into the cold start. As it will be immediately apparent, these instructions are not the same as the printed operational manual for the Viggen. Keepler has included the full cold and dark instruction with the module. I have developed 2 methods which will allow for a quick start and will eventually train you to perform the entire setup as mandated by the operations manual. An immediate difference in both cases, for example, is not using ground power. The Viggen does have a battery and for emergency reasons is capable of 1 or 2 starts from it. Purists will still need to call for ground power. In the same way this entire tutorial has been designed for use, I will present you the Scramble Start first, which for those new to the module and not set to experience system failures, will provide the entire startup in the minimum number of steps. I have defined the chapter marks for both start types, so you can navigate to which start method you want to use. On entering the cockpit, insert the data cartridge and arm the ejection seat. Next, close the canopy. All of the engine start controls are located together in this group here. Turn on main power, which will then alert the master caution. You can disable this now. Next, turn on the LT cran switch, then release the throttle idle, which acts as a high pressure fuel switch. Turn the generator switch to on, T, then flip the start switch. From here, the engine will begin to spool. Monitor the RPM gauge. Once RPMs hold stable, you need to wait for the CK-37 to power up. While waiting, uncage the backup ADI and flip the O2 switch. Verify that both altimeters are zeroed out. Adjust as necessary. By now, the CK-37 will be on. You can tell because the current longitude and latitude are flashing on the display. On the CK-37 data panel, rotate the knob to Ref Lola and switch the input switch to in from out. Enter 9099 and then press the Skew Mall button on the waypoint panel. Return the input switch to out and return the knob to Act Pause. Release the parking brake and you are ready to taxi. Switch the Master Mode knob to Nav to bring up the HUD symbology. As you can see, the Viggen can be started and launched in under 2 minutes. There's no INS to align or anything else that will delay you on the ground. The Viggen will taxi like other Western birds with nose wheel steering, which will automatically engage and disengage. This start method is designed for either a true scrambling start or to start learning to start the Viggen on your own. In the full start tutorial next, I will cover the details of what you're actually entering, and that system builds on the foundation from the Scramble Start. If practical, practice a number of these cold starts before moving on to the next section. Now we will cover my full starting procedure, which again differs from the official and heat blur procedure, but will ensure all required systems have been checked, started, and so forth before flight. While I take the time to explain elements in the procedure, 75% of this is verification steps. You can download my kneeboard checklist page from my Discord server. I will also be using it on screen as well. To begin with, you can either contact the ground crew to request ground power or operate from the onboard battery. If you anticipate a long wait on the ground, use ground power. I recommend ground power in night starts because you'll be able to adjust the lighting ahead of starting the engines. On entering the cockpit, insert the data cartridge and arm the ejection seat. Keep in mind, some groups may require the seat wait to be armed until the EOR. Next step is to close the canopy. The knob has a neutral middle position, so to open the canopy again, you will need to click the knob back twice. Next, turn on main power, or Huvudström. When required, my kneeboard will identify the English and Swedish identification. The master caution alarm will now sound. Click the button in the center to acknowledge the alarm. You can also opt to leave this beeping until you're done on this panel for speed. At this point, you can adjust the cockpit lights as needed. Next, turn on the low pressure fuel valve, then release the throttle to idle, which in turn will open the high pressure fuel valve. You will know you missed this step when the Viggen starts and then stalls out. Turn on the electrical generator. At this point, you can opt to start the engines now, performing the following steps after, which I find to be more efficient. However, the manual calls for these steps prior to your start, and I have preserved that for specific operational reasons. The choice is yours. Prior to starting the Viggen, we will conduct a series of checks. Verify that the autopilot yaw is set to 0. Verify the FR24 radio is set to norm larm, normal and guard. Verify the ADI is aligned with no flags. Verify the HUD is in the low position. Verify Slav SI is to Fran, off. Verify Hold CC is in LD, barometric. Uncage the backup ADI. Next we need to set the altimeters. In the Scramble Start, we just set these to 0, which would help us know our altitude for takeoff and landing. However, this does not set you up for success. So as not to confuse the startup procedure, following the startup lesson, I've added a section to cover the proper configuration of these systems. Understand now that you should zero out your backup altimeter and adjust your main altimeter QFE per the kneeboard. During takeoff, you can use the backup to determine your altitude over the ground if need be. Next, we will set the RWR settings as desired, per the checklist to have both lights and audio. This is the default. Again, the Swedish here is pretty easy to decode. Ljus is lights, which by deduction means Ljud would indicate the audio as well. Adjacent to this panel is our exterior lights, to be set as required by local policy. In most groups, the anti-collision light is used as a startup indication to warn ground crews to clear the intakes and afterburner. Again, you won't have to speak Swedish to determine roughly what each one of these switches does. Our next step is to set the magnetic variation depending on our operational theater. In DCS, you will need to set the variation between the north indication on the magnetic compass and the actual North Pole. I have included these values on the screen here and in my kneeboard pack. If you skip this step, your navigation and weapons delivery will in theory deteriorate. However, the TerNav system will make corrections as you fly, and if you properly utilize waypoint verifications, your delivery should not be far off in practice. We are now ready to flip the start switch. The previous verification steps take longer to explain than perform. If you do end up taking too long to perform them, though, you may consider starting the engines and then performing them to prevent a fuel flood situation. Keep in mind here that you will notice this start switch as well, this one having two modes for automatic and manual. This refers instead to allowing the engine to auto-start if it stalls, and is not part of the engine start procedure. Once started, monitor the RPM gauge until your RPMs are stable at just below 60%, at which point your other systems should stabilize in their gauges as well. Next, turn on pilot oxygen switch and wait for the CK-37 to load. When it has powered on, you will get data information in the display. The system is currently flashing the longitude and latitude, in that order, of your current position. Change the data panel mode to Ref Lola, which I remember as Ref being reference. This is because we need to reference our current location for the CK-37 to base our entire flight plan. Now, switch the input switch from out to in for input. All airport codes in the CK-37 are related to a 9 code, 9001 being the first airport in the database, 9999 being the last. In DCS, you can see the airport codes in the kneeboard, which can be important if trying to input a landing field in flight. All the fields are based per map module, and there are never more than 98 such fields. In DCS, the code 9099 is considered the load command, so you should think of this instead as a load data cartridge. Doing so will set your current airfield as the starting point. I make this point because a rational person would think you enter your current field instead of Airport 99. On the waypoint button panel base, there are two buttons, LSSKU and LSMAL. You will note that LSSKU starts and the chain goes up and down, ending at LSMAL. SKU is your departure airfield. So rationally speaking here, if we were to enter as a reference our departure location and enter it, we would press the SKU button. The LSMAL is your landing field, which will by default be the same field you took off from. If you make a mistake on entry, the Renza button will clear your entry. You can also just switch the input back to out and it will cancel the entry. All CK-37 inputs require a code and a corresponding entry button. At this time, you would ideally set all of your other CK-37 inputs as needed, for example, to set BK-90 settings or adjust anti-ship missile parameters. In the weapons tutorials, I will cover what these settings are, just know that this is the ideal time to enter these. Following CK-37 inputs, ensure the system is back to out and in the AKT pause position. Again, while not covered here, this would also be the ideal time to set your electronic warfare and weapons controls as well. Those will be covered in the weapons tutorials, but you would incorporate that data into this part of your startup.
Chief, turn off the ground power.
Copy. Ground ground power is now off.
Next, we will verify that the radar altimeter is powered on. The switch should be set in the till or on position. This is the default position. Verify that your pitch trim is 3 degrees up, and adjust if not the case, keeping in mind that up pitch is indicated by the needle pointing down. Press the control button to test all indication lights. In cold weather, turn on the Avicen motor, or engine anti-ice switch. Switch your taxi landing light to on. Down is on. Release the parking brake, and you are now ready to taxi. To re-engage the parking brake, hold the toe brakes down and then pull the knob back out. The Viggen taxis like all other Western nosewheel steering birds. The engagement is automatic based on weight on the nosewheel. Once you have reached the end of the runway, turn your master mode to nav to bring up the takeoff symbology on the HUD. This is done at the EOR to prevent the system from overheating without airflow over the fuselage. That'll take about 5 minutes. You are now ready to take off. Well, this full start has taken a while to explain. In practice, it only takes a minute or two longer than the Scramble Start. Familiarity with the Scramble Start will further help proficiency in this process. You will not use a majority of these controls again in flight, and as previously mentioned, what tends to confuse most new pilots to the Viggen is the weapon inputs and controls for the CK-37, which you can see now are done mostly on the ground with the kneeboard open. As mentioned in the startup, altimeter settings are critical to weapons deployment in the Viggen. Remembering that your barometric altimeter is based on sea level determinations, you must have the proper QFE for the airfield put in, which may indicate you're not exactly at 0 meters. Your primary altimeter is also the altimeter for the CK-37 computer, and your weapons releases, firing solutions, and navigation are all slaved to the correct configuration of this altimeter. In your kneeboard, you will have the QFE readings for each waypoint automatically calculated by DCS for your flight. You would generally set your QFE for takeoff point during startup. However, depending on the mission, you may elect instead to input your target waypoint QFE in, particularly if it's radically different or the operating theater is very small. This is a great example of multiple outputs to you, the pilot, of data, because while the CK-37 will require the main altimeter to calculate the firing solution and determine the CCRP release point, you can utilize your backup altimeter or the radar altimeter indications in the HUD during takeoff. Various pilots have different preferences, and you can develop your own. I have learned the worst time to adjust that knob to dial the correct QFE is rocketing through low-level ground defenses at treetop looking for missile launches and following my pop-up guidance. You have 3 independent altimeters. Use them. Do keep in mind, if your HUD CC is set for LD, barometric, your QFE is based on the main altimeter QFE. This is normally why you would want to adjust the QFE for each waypoint as your kneeboard shows, to maintain a set flight plan. However, if you're in the realm most Viggen pilots prefer to fly, your radar altimeter is more useful to you, and pre-inputting the target QFE may pay off in spades. You're now ready to fly. As previously mentioned, this series is intended to teach you through foundational familiarization, meaning that each lesson builds on the previous lessons while adding layers of information over time to reduce drinking from the fire hose. Our next lesson covers takeoff and navigation, followed by a lesson on all 3 landing methods for the AJS-37 Viggen. The Leadnap Gaming Discord server and website are useful sources of documentation like my kneeboard pack, as well as other pilots to help you through something if it just didn't make sense. Please, if you have questions, visit and ask. The Viggen is an incredibly fun module to fly in DCS, and one of the best ground attackers ever produced. Be finicky to learn at first, but it's remarkably easy once you understand the logic. Make sure to share this tutorial series with your DCS friends and other aviation fans. Subscribe if you haven't, and I will see you in the next lesson.